So the next topic of discussion is the actual changes and if they actually constitute censorship or not. Now, this is a very hot button issue for everyone involved in the gaming community, and a lot of people have strong opinions about this one way or the other. And so why don't we begin with Brian, and where he can discuss what exactly constitutes censorship and what doesn't.
Okay, so for this one, I think it's one of those it depends on the context of the matter issue again. Like, you can argue it both ways. Let's take, for instance, Animal Crossing. Like, a lot of those changes, like, they may be textual, but they're not censorship. Now, changing Lizardon's name to Charizard in the English version of Pokemon, not censorship. They both use the word lizard. You both understand what the Pokemon's about. But I think you could argue that, yes, it's kind of clear for most that Jinx would be considered censorship for being what many would see as a black stereotype, which, if I remember correctly, she's based off like this Japanese ice goddess, right? Who actually has a black face, like pitch black.
That does sound familiar.
Yeah, I believe that's what she's actually based off. But of course, Americans and children that are the target of Pokemon don't know that. And if you're a child that's been raised to notice racism, then you're going to call that out.
I think it wasn't even a child. I think it was an adult that originally pointed it out.
Oh, man.
It was like a thing on the news back in the day.
Yeah. It's so usually with Pokemon, I think Pokemon's probably the best example of how it can be censorship, but it also can't be. Like I stated, Lizardon, Charizard, you get it. It's a fire lizard. But then you get Pokemon like Umbreon, whose Japanese name is Blackie. And you cannot have that in the English version of Pokemon because that could be seen as racist. So it really depends on what you're dealing with. Umbreon means like Umbra and Eon, which you can interpret as a ghostly evolution or a magical one, right? It suits the Pokemon, but in Japan, I believe Blackie is for black and lucky. I think they see black cats as lucky, right?
Not entirely sure. I don't think I've heard of that.
Well, that's what I've seen. I think that's what Bulbapedia says. But yeah, it really depends on what you're dealing with. Like, I hate to bring it up, but Fire Emblem Soleil debate.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the instances where it was censorship, but I think it was one of those instances where you couldn't really fight it because even though in the original context it wasn't offensive, it was well intentioned when translated in English. Because we view things differently, you're going to get a controversy. Like that's what the whole thing was about, right?
Yeah. Before we get into the Fire Emblem discussion, I will say one thing is that Japan has a very different outlook on racism in general. Like blackface for comedy is still very widely accepted here.
Explains Mr. Popo.
So, Jared, why don't you give us your thoughts on this?
I agree. Context is everything. And I typically have a kind of guide I follow on whether this is or is not censorship. And a lot of times it kind of boils down to the removal of content aside from the changing of it. I think the removal of content is really when you start to cross into either censorship or self-censorship. So, like we were talking about with Fire Emblem, the removal of the petting minigame. I think when you're removing something and you have the intent behind it, to kind of save yourself from controversy, I think that does cross over into the realm of both censorship and self-censorship. So I try to kind of play it by that. Now, what we were talking about before with Animal Crossing, I wouldn't, of course, call that censorship. That definitely falls under the hood of localization. But when you start removing features and, when we're talking about Bravely Default, you could say that as a change with the costume switch from a Native American theme to a cowboy theme. I see that kind of as the removal of the Native American costume, and I kind of see that as an act of self-censorship. Whether it, a lot of times it's the meaning behind it is very, they're trying to save people from offense, so they're kind of they're trying to be as nice as they possibly can. But as someone who has very rarely been offended, that kind of just that rings on deaf ears for me.
And I think your video, I think it was with Censored Game, and it might have been a different video. Correct me if I'm wrong. But your point about the Entomodachi collection,
right? Yeah.
Where the gay marriage feature was removed, right? In the U.S. release, and a lot of outcry about that was done.
Wasn't that a bug?
It was a bug that allowed you to marry men, but when they brought it to the U.S., the idea of fixing that bug was for the reason that people would find homosexual marriage controversial.
Oh, was it men? I thought it was a bug where you could make a female look like a man, and when she married a man, she would accidentally wear a tux instead of a dress. That's how I remember it. I'm not sure if it was that.
From what I heard, and I could be wrong about this because I didn't follow it super closely, but I heard that was the workaround to getting homosexual marriage in the game, was creating a female that looked like a male, and then you could have them marry. And I think that was like a little workaround for it.
Oh, okay.
So it wasn't in the official release. It was it was an intentional feature. Yeah. And then so it was removed in localization. And then, of course, there was a lot of controversy. I remember the controversy surrounding that. Your point you made in the video is like, just because you don't agree with it, it doesn't make it not censorship.
Exactly, yeah.
I think that's something that a lot of people should understand.
Right.
So, personally, I don't think the skinship feature in Fire Emblem Fates was a very... I don't know how to say it. Like, it wasn't a feature that I don't agree with. Right.
And I get that. And this is a really good point. It's very important for me to say right off the bat. It's not super important. I may have played that up a little bit, but I probably would not enjoy the petting mini game, and you know what I mean. And let's say like Dead or Alive, Extreme Beach Volleyball. I don't enjoy those games, and the exclusion of the petting mini game in Fire Emblem wouldn't make me mad on the pure grounds that like, oh, well, this style of gameplay is what I enjoy. So if we have a game where young women are portrayed scantily clad, that's not something that I would personally put into a game if I had the decision. But I think what's important, and when it crosses into the realm of censorship, is when these things were put in the game, regardless of what I want, and then they were taken out on my behalf. That's when I think we fall into that censorship area. So, that I think that's what people are saying around the world is not so much, I love petting mini games and give them to me. I think they're saying, this was in the game, leave it in the game, because that's what the creator's original vision was.
I heard the development was actually pretty split on petting. Like half the team wanted it, half the team didn't.
We actually did that we did Sakurai's translation on that, and the don't need this, don't need that.
Yeah, it's there for some people.
Sakurai in that column states that it's an optional mini game, I guess, and that if you don't like it, then you don't have to play it. That's basically his viewpoint.
Okay, I have the English and Japanese versions of Birthright, and
if you'd like to check out the rest of this podcast, go on to sourcegaming.info. Make sure to like and subscribe to this channel so you can stay tuned for future updates.